world. Good afternoon. Are you there?
We think Liverpool's there, don't we?
We think Liverpool is there. So
welcome to Liverpool.
Welcome. Hello, Liverpool. So this is rather like the Eurovision Song Contest. If we're going to do everywhere that's available by name of place, that could take a long time. However, let's begin, shall we? So I'm Martin Foltley.
I'm Ali Daubney.
And we're here to look at aspects of assessment with you, with the grand title of Life After Levels, a guide to progression, curriculum and assessment in Key Stage 3 music. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of exciting aspects of assessment and teaching and learning and pedagogy. And here we go.
And the reason we called it that quite long, elaborate title is because for us, assessment isn't something that you look at on its own, but it comes alongside and with the curriculum planning and the pedagogies that go with that. So here is our premise really, that we're laying out our stall for you, that the curriculum planning should start with the learning and not the content. So you need to be sure about what you're wanting people to learn rather than just nice activities. And that the assessment derives from that, as does the curriculum and the way that you decide to go about that.
And that's one of the things that we think is quite important. And so often when people say, I'm concerned about what I should be assessing, then it's worth just doing a bit of a rewind and saying, well, what are you teaching? What are the kids learning? Because in many ways, what you're assessing should come from those. And there's all sorts of reasons we understand why it may not and why there may be other issues going on. But there are clearly aspects of teaching and learning which should then feed through into assessment. And that's really the basic premise that we're beginning with.
So when we put the document together, which we're talking through today, we started off thinking about some work which we've done recently in different contexts, thinking about the values in music education. And so stepping away from the kind of minutiae detail of I'm teaching this lesson and I've got this assessment and I've got to do this and I've got to do that, but actually looking at the whole underpinning of the music education. And so the document, we've had some really nice feedback on it, and one of the things that people have said is that the look at values has made them sit down as a department and to look at what are the values that they have in music education.
We put together a list, really, that we've come across when we've done this with teachers. And it's important that this isn't an exhaustive list, and in fact it might not have anything on it that's on your list. But it's an interesting aspect to really think about, what do you value? And you can take you as to be either singular or collective, as a department, or maybe even as a sort of group of schools, a hub, an academy group, whatever, and to think about what do you value and what is on your list. And that for many teachers that have done this, they haven't really thought about this, some cases ever, and in others for a number of years.
So we've put together a series of big questions, as we've called them in the document, for you to kind of work your way through. And the first one relates to what it is that you value. And the second question looks at how do those values appear in your curriculum. And so if you were, the straw poll, I suppose, is if you asked pupils about the values that you kind of put through your music curriculum, are they the things you would want them to be? Are they that it's inclusive or creative, that it's enjoyable for everybody? You know, what would they say? Would their view be the same as yours? And do your values appear at all in your Key Stage 3 curriculum?
And other questions that we've put here are the nature of the Key Stage 3 curriculum. So, for example, is it topic-based? We know that many are. If it is, what order are the topics in? If it's not topic-based, what do you have instead? And there's an awful lot of similarity that we see in Key Stage 3 curricula, and we see an awful lot of topic-based curricula. But an interesting question is to wonder about, why are the topics in this order? I have a PhD student at the moment, Anthony Anderson, who's looking at this very thing. He's a full-time music teacher, and the range of orderings of topics that he's come across is really interesting. So why are you doing these topics, and why are you doing them in this order?
Another thing about the values, we've done this activity kind of live in workshops, not saying dead today, but just live generally.
Speak for yourself, Ali.
Is that the values which people come up with, there's often some transferable ones in there, and there's things that list with the SMSC, spiritual, moral, social and cultural curriculum and ideas that are in schools, but there are also usually some things which are exclusively musical and things that almost, justify on a musical sense, not for the transferability, but for the music itself. And so, there's things in there that you could think about when you're trying to compile your list. Sit down with a mind map and have a look at all of those kinds of things.
And it's also important to say that your school is probably very different to a school that's very close to you. So what do your values look like might not be the same as one that's just across the road. But they are things that you value, and maybe importantly, what are the things that you value that the kids also value? So how are they there, and how do they figure in terms of what you do?
That might also go beyond the classroom, because the values that you're talking about are kind of through the ether of the school, as well as just being something which is just around the curriculum music. And that's also something that we've thought about quite a lot with assessment, and how do you bring in assessment which actually recognises children's whole musical worlds. And so the values thing actually links very closely with that.
And that takes us into the notion of pedagogies. And we've used pedagogies as a plural quite deliberately here, because we feel that there's a range of pedagogies that teachers employ at Key Stage 3. So we've put some examples here: group work, whole class performing, singing, workshopping, musical futures, just as a generic term. I don't want to get shouted at by the musical futures people, or probably the singing people, or any of the other people. But if these have a distinct pedagogy for you, what does it look like? And do you use different pedagogies for different topics? And that's an interesting question for teachers to reflect on. Do you teach different things in different ways? And again, an awful lot of these things have no right answers. One of the big trends in education at the moment is this notion, I'm going to use an air quotes, I'm sorry if people have said this, is what works? And that's a really difficult question, because in many ways, one of the things that we've talked about is we actually think it's better to say what works for this person in this context, in this school, in this area, right now with this class. And that might not be what works for that person in this school, etc., with another class. And so there's a whole variety of things. So what works can be different, and maybe that's how you use your different pedagogies.
So we asked you at the beginning about the values, and looking at a list of values, and I suppose something which has come up over and again is around whether those values are in any way part of what you assess and how you decide across your music education in your school if the music education lives up to the values which you have decided are the kind of philosophical underpinning.
And so there's a point here where we ask people to revisit the lists that you made. So having thought about that, then where are they in your assessments? So how are they evidenced? And are any missing, or maybe we've used the phrase underrepresented? And so there's issues with exactly what are you assessing? And this takes us to the why are you assessing it question that many people ask. And the answer to that becomes, I'm assessing it because I value it. And then we can rephrase the question, do you value what you assess, or do you assess what you value? Or is it a combination of both? And we know that from our work that when we've been looking at national curriculum assessment, particularly in the levels which no longer exist, that many people had an awful lot of value in what they assessed. And for some people, actually assessing what they valued didn't come into it terribly much. So there's some important questions that we ask people to think about there.
I suppose the next kind of big question that goes alongside that is, what is the purpose of the Key Stage 3 music in your school? And I know that we've talked about this briefly in previous webinars, but the point is, if you're going to go through this thinking exercise, then this is the opportunity to kind of really have a good look at something and think about what do I want to get from it? Is it just a preparation from Key Stage 3 into Key Stage 4? So, just for a GCSE, or is it for everybody? Because the statistics still show that around 93% of children give up music at the end of Key Stage 3, and possibly there are things around assessment that have got something to do with that and how children feel about themselves at the end of Key Stage 3.
And there's some interesting conceptualizations that can take place there relating to the things that Ali's talking about. So do you think about progression in your school working backwards from Key Stage 4? In other words, you start with GCSE, then you work your way back through to Year 7? Or do you start with what the kids come in at in Year 7 and then work through to Key Stage 4 and GCSE? So which way is your planning going? Because as Ali said, if 93% of kids are stopping at a certain position whenever your Key Stage 3 ends, Year 8, Year 9, whatever, then that means that 93% of the kids have completed their musical education at that point. So there's some issues there to think about. And maybe that's a point to think in terms of whose music figures in your Key Stage 3 curriculum. Again, there are no right answers, but people who say, well, I'm starting to prepare them for GCSE, means that they then are missing out an awful lot of music because there's not time to do everything. So if you're doing this, you're not doing that. So there are some other questions which relate to what's going on here.
I think something else that links with that is some research I've recently done with my colleague Duncan McQuillan. I know Martin has done a similar study in a different area, which shows that the amount of music which is available, the time available for people in secondary schools varies hugely. And so within that, if you're on a carousel and you're only giving children 15 hours of music education across a year, which actually only covers part of a year, you're going to have very different education to schools where there's 2 hours a week and 60 hours per year allocated across either a 2-year or perhaps a 3-year period, although that seems to be becoming less prevalent as well.
Yes, there's some issues because obviously if you have a 2-year Key Stage 3, which is truncated to Year 7 and 8 only, then effectively you've lopped a third of the available curriculum time before you start. Then if you factor in the things that Ali was talking about in a carousel arrangement, there really are issues in terms of where do kids get to before they make their option choices. But there's some other questions as well. So the next one that we put there was, are there spaces for pupil voice and or pupil choice? So what is the nature of the music education that they are getting? And then this next one is a really key one. Is it designed to feed extracurricular music activities? And if so, are these available and desirable to all pupils? Do the kids want to be participating in them? And there's all sorts of things that can be taking place there in terms of what the kids are doing.
There's also lots and lots of different styles, genres, traditions, historical periods which you could look at. And so I suppose this is about saying, well, I'm teaching blues, gamelan and Indian. Why am I doing that? Is that the right thing for my school right now? It's just an opportunity when you start looking at all of this to think about actually what is in there and why is it there, and perhaps it is the right thing in your school, and perhaps there's other things you might want to think about.
And we've put a little list of them there on the right-hand side of the slide as you look at it. We don't need to go through them all in order, but there's some interesting reflective questions in terms of what is in and what is out of the things that you teach at Key Stage 3. And so there's some really quite tough decisions that music teachers have to make. And when we've done all that, one of the things that we've then moved on to thinking about are connections in the ways in which you package your Key Stage 3 curriculum and your answer to the previous big questions. And then finally on this slide, is this explicit in your curriculum documentation? So is it clear what's going on in terms of the way that this is done?
Curriculum documentation itself is actually quite interesting because schools these days have to publish their curriculum. But what does that mean? Does that mean that you put up just the topics, or do you put up the holistic kind of assessment that you use within topics? And that probably varies quite a lot as well.
And that's the question, yes, on our next one is about what you're actually doing in terms of what you are publishing. And do you have to justify this? I mean, the classic example of this is when the kids say, why are we doing this? So there's some real straightforward consumer voice that you're doing this. You're doing this because, but also, where else is it being justified? And an interesting question is, are any of the topics you teach covered anywhere else? So do you have a curriculum map that works and that you know that certain topics figure in certain places? Maybe that there's a possibility for joined up thinking. We've also there talked about skills that you teach, and we've put a few down there. But again, there are aspects of this to think about. Another big debate in education at the moment, as you all know, is that there is a dichotomy which is forming, or has formed, between skills and knowledge. In a way, one of the things that we've said is that we think music teachers are actually ahead of the game on this, because we know that you need both skills and knowledge in music education. And so where are they? What do they do? And there's these sort of bigger skills, or softer skills, whatever you want to say. So as well as knowing which way up you blow down a xylophone, then you also have these other skills that are taking place there.
I think you could say the national curriculum as it stands, if your school's following the national curriculum, is extremely flexible and doesn't really stipulate what you need to be doing. So at the end of the day, has anybody ever asked you why you are teaching? I think we were just talking about that with pupils, but have you ever had to justify to a senior leadership team why it is you've got samba in your units of work? Really, these are questions you have to justify to yourself and to the kids.
Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. So, but indeed, that first one of why do you, to whom, maybe you should say, do you have to justify your curricular choices? But significant, because in many cases we know that teachers don't have to do this. So there's some issues there. And the same question can be asked about pedagogies. So if you are justifying or not your curriculum, are you also justifying your pedagogies for teaching? And then do you have to modify, for example, the school circumstances? And we know that there are some very interesting whole school policies that people have to operate within the constraints of. So the notion, for example, of learning outcomes being written down can take an awful lot of time. We've already said you can only have a few minutes for music. If a lot of that is spent actually just writing down the targets, writing down the learning outcomes, then a lot of time is taken out of what is quite a short amount of time in terms of what's going on for music.
There's things I've been hearing about in the last few weeks about push on literacy again in some lessons, and where pupils have to have 5 or 10 minutes dedicated reading time. So how do you justify that within the music? And can you? What else can you look at to do that? There's other things like the dedicated improvement reflection time, DIRT time, which came up quite a bit last year, where you have to have that at fixed points during the lesson, and all of that actually links into ways of assessing and how you assess, as well as what you assess.
Yes, and so a question here is, are your kids bringing in their musical skills and enthusiasm from beyond the classroom? And so there's a whole range of things that we can consider with regard to that as well.
Oh, assessment. We had to get there eventually. So the first part of the presentation today is really just to give you lots and lots of food for thought that we would urge you to go away and think about quite seriously before you get into what am I assessing, how am I assessing, when am I assessing, and why am I assessing.
And we can now then start to think about the difficult assessment questions. And let's just think about some of them. So what are the purposes of your assessment? And for me, this links with the question just a few below that: who is the assessment for? Pupils, teachers, systems, parents. And again, in previous webinars, we've talked about that. So what are the purposes and who are the assessments for? Now we have another interesting issue about, do you assess holistically or atomistically? Do you take the whole of a piece of music, or do you separate it bit by bit and assess it? And there's some interesting things there. And again, are there right answers? Well, probably not, because music isn't quite like that, is it? But sometimes we see examples where there are an awful lot of atomistic assessments, but actually very little holistic assessment, or even the notion of musical assessment. And so do you think your assessment supports musical learning? If you atomize things down to the nth degree, you can actually miss out on, is this a musical, whatever it is, performance, composition, whatever, because you're too busy atomistically assessing whether or not they've got their shoelaces done up, or whatever the musical equivalent of that is. And so there are issues with that. And then, are you and your school, are the systems separating assessment of attainment from assessment of progress? And this is a whole thorny issue at the moment in terms of attainment and progress.
Yeah, I think that links very much to a lot of what we've been hearing recently about flight paths and how they're constructed in the first place, what they're useful for, and whether they may be showing progress or whether they're showing attainment at particular points. Something else that keeps coming up is about assessment moments, which links to the flight paths in that you take the assessment at that time on that task, but that actually doesn't allow for anything else that comes from around it in terms of the holistic, what's happened musically. I'm just going to ignore all of that other stuff and put down something for that, which seems a little bit against the grain for kind of holistic assessment.
And we know that schools are being exalted to remove levels. And Robin Hamilton in his blog last year talked about, I can't remember the exact phrase, something like, please don't replace one system of numbers with another one. And some of the things that we've seen actually do look awfully like levels reinvented because they work in a sort of stepped sequence. And so there are issues here of attainment and assessment of progress. What is going on in them? And I'm becoming quite concerned about the notion of a glass ceiling. So is your assessment system actually preventing musical music making, if that's not tautological, because you're actually so concerned with making sure that this small degree of progress has been made? And so one of the things for music is this issue about who owns the decisions, because we know that some schools are spending a large amount of money on commercial systems, and then music teachers are being asked to sort of step into them. So how does that work for you? Is it working for you?
One of the reasons for this documentation, actually, when we started talking about what we could do to help teachers, comes about because of that, because we are very mindful that there are whole school commercial systems which sometimes schools are buying before they're even properly developed. They pay the money and get the system afterwards on kind of the goodwill it's going to work. But I think we're trying to make the case here that perhaps, well, certainly music and perhaps the arts and other subjects more generally cannot fit in with these whole school assessment packages. And so it's about offering different ways to do things and giving you some opportunities to try things out and go along to senior leadership and say, I've tried this, other schools have tried this, perhaps we could adapt it.
And this then produces the issues that we get because of baselining. So we know that many schools are looking at targets and target setting, and there's some issues in terms of what it's based on. So a number are based on maths and English scores at Key Stage 2. We know that there's Fisher Family Trust materials, CAT scores, predicted GCSE grades, all these other things. Who decides? And the question is, what does tracking mean in your context for you? Because there are quite specific meanings about what's going on and what it is.
So something we've got to mention earlier is that there's a question function within the software which we're using today for you to either put up some statements or some questions about some of the things which are coming up. And some of these bigger questions like, what does tracking mean in your context? It is actually quite interesting for us to be able to pick things up as we go along.
And we're now going to squint at the screen to read some very small questions that
But we've just got some hellos at the moment.
Hello, lots of hellos.
If there's anything that's arising that you want to kind of comment on or chat about, then do feel free and we will certainly try and pick them up during the session.
And I can apologise now, I am the varifocal wearer, so hence the odd head angle when I'm looking at what's going on. Good, okay. So we've looked at that. Let me just... So this is a question that relates very much to it. Who owns your assessment data? So are you doing what Ofsted said back in 2011? Do you have this portfolio, a well-ordered catalogue of recordings over time, supported by commentaries and scores? And how do you use them? Interestingly, I think that this is an I think, and I know this is very dangerous, but I do think if you're recording things, it's actually a good idea to play them back as well. Because I do know of situations where people have a huge arsenal of stored recordings that nobody has ever listened to. And it does strike me that this is actually something that the kids might actually be able to hear. And so that's what the phrase about do you use them formatively is about. So do you use these recordings in a formative fashion? And this then takes us on to the question about formative comments, because again, this is something which we are worrying a lot about. We know that the verbal feedback given stamps that teachers are being given, what actually do you do with them? What do you do with them if you've had a class singing lesson? What do you stamp? So, you know, kids' foreheads, the air, the song, what do you do? So how do you record formative things to do with music making?
There was a teach meet last week in Brighton. I'll just give it a quick plug. But the absolutely great thing about the teach meet in Brighton was that it was sponsored by the ISM. No, the great thing about it was that there were quite a few teachers who were talking about the other aspects of their work who gave absolutely great examples of formative developmental assessment and the comments to help drive musical learning forwards. And it wasn't really the main part of what they were talking about, but they were talking about lots of different systems that they used, for example, for Edmodo and various apps, where the pupils could still go back to that. And so it was actually all through the discussion in the first place, or another example of a school who, towards the end of a unit of work, would give some written pointers from themselves and from other pupils and give that back to pupils. In a way to try and get them to engage with the comments before they kind of finished it off, so to take the advice on all the way through. So there are some really great examples coming out of schools, but they're all a little bit under the radar.
Yes, under the radar chart. So yes, which we'll be talking about in a while. Stay tuned. We'll get to radar charts in a moment. So reporting, there's a whole raft of things about reporting. How often do you have to do it? What do you have to report on? How do you do it? What's going on? Are you allowed to report on actual attainment? This is an interesting one. This is the linear progress issue. Can you have something which is a grade lower than its predecessor? So all sorts of issues have come in terms of what reporting is like. So there's some very interesting issues to do with the way that's working.
There's an interesting question coming here which says, how can we say what standard has been attained by pupils during Key Stage 3? Which is a very interesting and quite a big question that we hope that we can pick up on bits. But now that it actually says now that levels have gone, when are we recording pupils' progress? I mean, the thing about the levels was the misuse in the first place, that the progress perhaps would have been reported at the end of each key stage in the first instance, but now it seems to be every unit something is happening, and we'll come on a little bit later actually to some ideas about what you might be looking for in particular units of work.
So we've talked so far about planning. We're now moving on to the notion of planning for learning. And what we have here is a statement from the document that we've produced for the ISM, which is this. And so really we're going to be talking about these various phrases, and we're looking at long-term, medium-term and short-term planning. And we said at the very outset that we see planning as being crucial to the development of assessment. And so we really want to just spend a little bit of time just thinking about aspects of this.
Some of the questions have come up already around how does the planning bring in children's musical experiences from beyond the classroom into the planning that you are doing within the classroom. What we have here is an idea of a spiral assessment, and the thing to notice is we've picked out some things which you might say are the kind of inherently musical activities which you do: the singing, the improvising, the playing, composing, and then we've got a big one around the middle which comes up at various points called critical engagement. And really our kind of underpinning thought with this is that critical engagement goes through everything which you do, you would hope. And so that's kind of why that's there. And then there's a separate category.
Can I just say on that point for critical engagement,
sure,
we didn't just want to put listening, so we put critical engagement to be more than listening.
And we've got some examples of these coming up, so it's a kind of whistle-stop tour. We'll come back to it in about 10 minutes and park the idea. But some work we did with some teachers in Brighton a few months ago gave them the opportunity to think that a lot of the kind of social skills that go alongside music and musical learning are actually entrenched in helping to make progress. So if you haven't got any stickability, or you can't stay in a rehearsal, whatever it may be, it's actually very difficult to help some of the musical learning to go forwards, which is why we've also tried to thread social, moral, spiritual and cultural education through everything here.
And spirals in music education have a long history of being used, and like everything in our work that we've produced in this document, we would very much like people to engage with it as appropriate for them. So there might be things in your context that you think, I really want. In that case, that's fine, but we would like people to be thinking about this, because we talked earlier about the notion of teaching at Key Stage 3 often being topic-based, and one of the things that we think is quite interesting is the arrangement of the topic. So how do these aspects, or what is important to you, how do they flow through what you're doing? Something
else to bear in mind here is that you could look at this and go, well, it's a spiral, it's going upwards, it's just linear progression in another way. But the fact is it's a spiral, so you can come down a couple of steps, as Janet Mills talked about in her writing of years ago. You know, so sometimes it may be a consolidating phase, and you're kind of coming back down the spiral before you start going back through again.
And Keith Swalnick talked about this as well in the piece he did with June Tillman. When they talk about when you start doing something else, you tend to go a few steps back down the spiral. Can you do that on the spiral? Anyway, you go a few turns below and then start moving through again. And so that's an important notion, and that does fly against linearity. And yes, we can critique a spiral, but we were trying to get a 2D representation of it. And it was a 2D representation we wanted in contrast to the straight line progression that we see taking place a lot in schools.
I think also it's about integration of all of these things to make a kind of rich and well-rounded music education. And that was also what got us thinking about each of these things. Now, the point about them is, as we'll come on to in a minute, that they're listed here atomistically, effectively, but there's quite a lot of overlap between them. And so to kind of think about that when you're planning is a really useful thing.
So we're now going to move on to looking at the framework itself. And so we're thinking about the way that we've put it together. And this is essentially a description of how it's done. And so you can see that we have the idea of a planning framework, and then we've got a series of example criteria statements. And we'll talk through some of these.
So we've got some questions just popped in, I
think. Oh, excellent.
That we'll have a quick look at as we go along.
A quick squint at in my case. Oh, that's a long one.
When schools are pressed to demonstrate linear progression of at least 4 levels of progress from the typical Fisher Family Trust, it seems that the senior leadership team need to be advised of the need for assessment without levels, and not necessarily music teachers. I think we would certainly agree with that in the works that we've done. And I mean, this kind of document is the kind of thing, and some examples from schools, of course, which I think is probably the only way to make a difference.
And I think on that one there where it says needs more joined up thinking from Ofsted, I think from the things, it's worth looking at Robin Hamilton's blog, the HMI, because I think in many ways Ofsted are there and they are saying things like this. I think the issue, as a questioner has said, is their school senior leadership team. And I think that's where issues have come to rest. So I think Ofsted agree, music teachers agree, and I think that there's a sort of fight into the middle in terms of what's going on.
There's also a question on here from David about any ideas about conducting a robust baseline assessment in just 50 minutes. If I was being honest about it, which I'm going to be, I would say I doubt it's possible. Because if you're trying to think about a robust baseline assessment about what children can do, then that takes a lot of time. And certainly I'm guessing that David's question is really thinking about the beginning of year 7, when children are settling into a new environment, perhaps not that confident yet to show what they can do, and what it is that they yes, he says yes, it is year 7, because they can hear us.
Gosh,
yeah, so
there is somebody out there.
actually, one of our local schools in Brighton and Hove has been thinking a lot about the baseline assessments and has managed to get agreement that the whole of the year 7, and they still have to go on the flight paths eventually, but the whole of the year 7 is for working out where children are, and there's another school where they have 1 term to work out, which is still not ideal, but is probably better than having it in 1 lesson. Certainly my own thought and experience of teaching is that in 50 minutes it's just not possible.
I think this is a case of, well, what do you want the assessment for and who is it for? Are the different questions. Because if you're simply producing a number on an Excel spreadsheet that somebody is then going to use to see how well you've taught them, that strikes me as a very different sort of baseline assessment for finding out what the kids have done, what they can do, what the range of musical knowledge, skills and understanding they bring with them is. And I think that would be quite hard to do in 50 minutes.
Now, we've got an abundance of Davids today, it seems, because another David has just said, why would you baseline just have to take place in a single lesson? So really, just to be clarifying the point there, I was really replying to somebody's question about, is it possible to do that in 1 lesson of 50 minutes? That's certainly not our...
No. Somebody said, are we able to see the questions too? And we'll have to hand that over to the tech team to provide an answer as to whether you can see the questions too or not. So we are merely sitting here sharing.
Yeah, sharing.
I have no idea whether everybody can see the questions or not, but hopefully somebody will tell us the answer.
Okay, shall we move on to the next part?
Indeed, let's move on. So
really, we've put together a framework for, it's I suppose another thinking framework, a bit like what we did last year for primary. It's to be used in lots of different ways and flexibly, and it comes in 2 parts. And we'll talk you through each of the parts. The first one has just appeared on your screen.
And the first one indeed has just appeared on your screen. And so really this all links back to the boxes that we had at the beginning. You have that very big question at the top, which is how does what you value appear in your Key Stage 3 curriculum? And you'll see it carries through there. And then there's a whole range of things about being musical through down on the left. And you can see all of those there, singing, playing, improvising, etc. We've left a box at the bottom to say, what would you put in this box? Because we're very, very conscious that every school is different. So we've put 1 box blank. Do you need more boxes? What do you do that you would want the pupils to evidence being musical through? And there's a whole raft of things that could go on there. And so one of the things that we'd like you to use this for, should it prove useful at all, is as a thinking tool. And so what's going on in terms of the questions here then also goes to the ways in which you then move across towards the right, which is the notion of the other questions which these boxes, columns and rows are asking.
So if we looked at the kind of middle of this, having decided what the knowledge, skills and understanding are, you then obviously look at the materials. Before we get into the actual assessment, which we're trying to think around quite holistically, there's a question which has just come in about age-related expectations that we'll pick up on a little bit later. I've just made a note of that, so that's to come.
So on the left we have how does what you value appear in your Key Stage 3 curriculum, and then that moves through seamlessly, we would hope, to how does what you value appear in your assessment. And so that takes you through to the right hand side of this picture. There's a very strange white gap in the middle. That's simply for printing purposes, because this is a grab from the way the PDF is presented. If you look at it printed, there's no big white gap there, because people have asked us about that. So there's all sorts of things there in terms of what's going on, where is it happening, and all those questions. Let's now try and unpick down in a little bit more detail. So we've talked about this. This is the top row of the left-hand side, which is how does what you value appear in your Key Stage 3 curriculum. And there's a range of things there that we hope reflect on the values that you've got. And then we move on this side to the notion of being musical through. So what are the various bits and pieces? So we've talked about this to some extent already, but these are things which only you can answer in your school. And down at the bottom, the sort of white boxes that aren't coloured in have the sort of big type question related to it. Because there's all sorts of things going on here. There's the how, the what, and the why questions. And these are different, but they do require teachers to think about them and then try and move these on to the ways that they're going to assess them.
So in a way, as we were saying earlier, it's almost about parking the assessment and deciding what is the ideal music curriculum that I'm trying to create and how am I going to do that? Oh, how do I assess it? Rather than the assessment being, I've got to do this, so I've got to do this kind of assessment, so I'm going to do this kind of delivery. And so it's kind of tipping that upside down as well. Think about what you want first.
Indeed. Then we have some questions about curriculum materials and the sorts of things that you're going to be using. And you're in control of these. So why have you got them? What are you using? And in particular, why these materials? So one of the things that we do know is that the penetration of published schemes into Key Stage 3 music is actually quite slight. So we do know that many teachers are working with things which they've devised themselves, which is interesting. And it does mean that teachers are in control of it. So we've asked you the values question. We do keep banging on about it because we do think it's important. But it is. So there's this question again that we've asked again here. And then we move towards the assessment criteria and we ask you questions about what's going on and how is it assessed. And so again, these are things for you to consider in your school.
Something that you perhaps need to think about a lot, because I think it happens. I saw Martin put something up recently about formative assessment, saying we were doing that before everybody else. Don't tell us how to do it, ask us how to do it. But the first column, vertical column on this slide says how, where and why are you using these in a formative developmental fashion. So actually thinking about what is all of the great formative developmental stuff that you do, and trying not to be kind of too hung up on that. I know some schools are quite demanding on that front, but there's so much other stuff we do which is much, much richer and helps children to develop musically.
Indeed, and it's the formative stuff that we do really well, and we've been doing it really well for donkey's years. So we do need to keep a firm hold of what we do well. We move now to a series of sample assessment statements, and we can't say too strongly the word sample. These are samples, and it is definitely not an exhaustive list. It's merely examples, and we've chosen a few sort of randomly, just to give you examples. Really, really important. We do worry that these do need to be produced by people in their context. Now, I know that's the sort of cop-out answer people say, but do really think about them and how they're going to work.
Very much to a question which has come in from David about age-related, or it's a statement really, about age-related expectations. As I was saying earlier, if you've got 15 hours a year as opposed to 60 hours a year in school, your age-related expectations, if there were even such a thing, would be entirely different. But actually, the primary work which we did, we talked about different stages of learning and to try and get away from the idea of age-related expectations, and certainly within every school they would look very different.
I do, and like Ali, I worry about age-related expectations because let's look at our instrumental friends at the moment, because grades 1, 2, 3, 4, let's just take those, don't have age-related expectations. You can do them at all sorts of, well, you can do it at any age you like, can't you? So what would that mean if we transfer it to the classroom? I think there are questions there that we can usefully ask ourselves. So here are some sample assessment statements. And what we want these to do is to be measurable, and I hesitated before I used that word because I worry about what measuring means, that we're trying to make these so that they can be assessed, evaluated, graded on a 3-point scale. And we'll talk about the 3-point scale a bit in a minute, but you just need to know as we're talking about them that we're looking at a very, very simple can't do yet, can do really well type grading. We've both talked in the past and in previous webinars about assessment by accretion, and we've seen examples of assessments where, as the assessment progresses to providing a higher grade, it has more in it, so that by the time we get to the last thing, it's able to do this, and this, do the choreography, make the tea, clean the classroom, and all these other things at the same time. And we think that it's actually quite helpful to try and take that apart and think of a single criterion which you can then assess using the 3-point scale that we've talked about.
The other thing to think about is over what period of time are these actually taking place? Because within every unit of work, which we're going to also come on to in just a minute, you've got some learning that you want, and so there's inevitably, and it's good that there is, some kind of straw poll for yourself about what's been learned in that. So one of the things we're kind of, I suppose, urging people to do is to consider within each unit of work, what is the learning that you want and what is the assessment that goes alongside that.
Absolutely. And so there's issues with this. There's questions about how this does relate, because we've got some other questions coming in. We don't think you can see each other's questions at the moment, but somebody's asked about the pupil who arrives in Year 7 with grade 2 or higher, are they in the exceeding bracket of age-related expectations for performing already? Well, who knows?
Well, and that's also why age-related expectations don't work.
I was going to say, because what happens if they started doing wider ops in Year 4, and then they were in a local authority where they carried on in Year 5, and then they opted into Year 6, they could have had 3 years learning to play a musical instrument before they get to secondary school. And there's a point at which then a little bit of me does worry about when I hear, well, I assume they don't know anything and start again. You think, well, actually, they could have had 3 years of learning to play the ocarina or something. So maybe it's not the case that they don't know anything. So we do need to think about that. So on the PowerPointy type thing in front of you, we've got some example criteria for singing, improvising, and composing. And we have some more here in even a smaller font for playing, critical engagement, and SMSC. And we have deliberately not included the same number of each, because, as I say, we very, very firmly wanted this to be an example, not a model. And so the ones there, yes, of course, use them and think about them, but we can't be in every single school in order to see the sorts of things that are taking place when people are actually using them.
We briefly mentioned critical engagement earlier, and you can see now from these statements the kind of things that you may, and they're just examples, there's many more for you to be thinking about with the critical engagement that goes through every single unit. Communicates own work to an audience in an appropriate fashion, discusses and critiques the music of others appropriately, links very much with some of the SMSC assessment outcomes that we might be looking at here, engages in purposeful rehearsal techniques, is prepared to take creative risks. A lot of children just aren't prepared to take creative risks. And so some of these things, when you're planning what it is you want children to do, finding ways into risk-taking for them is extremely important.
And so this takes us to the grading that we talked about earlier. And we think it's quite important that the assessment criteria statements produced, and as I say, ours are examples, do need to be measurable in some way. So here's a statement about producing the one statement, a statement about a statement, that's interesting, a meta statement, producing one statement where we have outcomes delineated by attainment level. And again, this is not having 3 separate outcome statements. We want life to be workable for people in the classroom. So we've taken an example criterion of improvises, simple responses, which mostly echo source materials. And then we hope that this is able to be used in a straightforward 3-point, is not yet able to, is able to, is confidently able to. You can put your own phraseology here. We were thinking of this in a shorthand of mathematical symbols of minus, equals, and plus. And so that's how you can do it. And then we think that you can build these up. Don't have too many for a single unit of work, whatever you call it, because otherwise you'll make life unworkable. So do just think about small numbers and being able to use them.
So what we're going to move on to look at now is units of work and some examples of planning. And I've thought about this. The reason that we've given 2 examples, I think, from film music is because if you move a unit, just the title, from one place to another in the curriculum, actually it's moved the place in the developmental sequence of learning as well. So the first 2 examples that are here give an example of how that works.
Indeed, and so you've got this idea of being early in the key stage 3, and so there's some things that we've put in there. So we've put this idea of singing. You can read it all there, but there's a range of things that is going on, and as Ali said, where they are is quite significant in terms of what you expect. And so when you actually start to move towards the assessment grid for it, then you are going to be producing the assessment criteria statements we talked about, hopefully in a way that makes it possible for you to do it so that you can collect assessment data which is meaningful but isn't going to overburden you in terms of what you've got.
And also that you can collect it through the unit of work. And it could be that your grade 2 person who is coming into the class might have a different set of statements to other children as you get to know them. Now, there's a lot of statements here. We definitely are not saying you need something or 2 things for every thing which you're talking about in the unit. So the idea of these is that you would have some, but we've put up kind of quite a lot of examples. So we're definitely not saying you need 12 statements for every pupil for every unit of work. And it may be that in some units there's more of a focus on something than there is in another unit.
Yeah, and so what we have here is now moving towards late in key stage 3. And again, the focus will differ. So we know, even using our main terminologies of singing, composing and improvising, some of them might not be a focus for a unit. And we do worry that sometimes people have tried to shoehorn absolutely everything in to a single assessment scheme. And it's entirely reasonable that over time, some things appear more than others, but that they build up into something which is reasonable, but that a single lesson might not encapsulate all of these.
We've got another interesting point which has just come in. It says in Knowsley and Sefton, the NSEAD, which is the Subject Association for Art and Design, have put out age-related expectations, and they've been held up as a model of good practice. So how we're now expected to make those music, so what can we do about that, and how can we tell them it's not a good idea? One of the things I would suggest is that in art and design, they have their artifacts. In music, we have our sound. So, for example, collecting examples of musicking with a range of different young people and taking a portfolio along and saying, yes, all right, you tell me which of these is the norm, because it very much depends on the experiences. So you need to find probably a musical way to explain to somebody else who's perhaps not entrenched in our world that that's the case.
It might also be a case of taking them to go and hear the range of what's happening in primary schools. If you go to a primary school concert where they have had a lot of white rocks, for example, and have a big primary school orchestra or band or whatever, this can be very significantly different to one which has had very little. And I don't know, I can't talk about art in any great extent, but I don't think the equivalent of white rocks exists in art. And so that for me would be an issue there.
There's a comment just coming from Holly, which actually links to this next slide. She's asking, what are our thoughts on specific skills per project? The head of department has asked me to roll out either a composition or performance topic with appraisal throughout. Now, the second example which we've put up here, late in Key Stage 3, you can see that in this we've put a different focus on the assessment criteria. So, for example, the first unit that we looked at had a focus on singing. This one here says criteria can be chosen if necessary. And the idea of this was to show you that you can focus on one thing or another. I mean, within a unit of work, if you were performing, you might legitimately, hopefully, do some improvising and some composing and vice versa as well. But you don't have to necessarily, you can have, if you need to have an assessment focus, which you probably will, then that's absolutely fine.
So, if we then think about this, this statement here really takes apart what Ali has just said and then puts it back together again. And so we do want people very much to be focusing on what they can do themselves in their schools and in their contexts. I think we were just now, bearing in mind the time, want to move on to thinking about grading. And so what the proposal that we use, we claim no original ANSI fault whatsoever. It's been used in all sorts of contexts and all sorts of other places elsewhere, and is simply a charting function that Excel does automatically for you. Other spreadsheets are available, the Mac user quickly adds. But you can do this if you have a friendly maths teacher at the press of a button. Other subjects are available too. So, but it's a simple thing, and so it's a function of a spreadsheet software. Perhaps I should be advertising free as much as possible, that you'll be able to do. And all that we've done is put a number into an assessment grid up at the top, and you can see the grid, and then simply asked the aforementioned non-specific spreadsheet software to produce a chart based on it. And this is the chart. And one of the reasons that teachers have said that they quite like this is because over time you can build up a whole range of these. And so here's another one which shows a different unit superimposed on the top. You can actually, in some spreadsheet packages, make the various pictures, I call them kites after Kolb and his work. So the kite shapes, that one is a kite shape, you can actually make them transparent. So you can see through to how progression is taking place over time, and then you can see how people score in different aspects. And then if you add them together, then the spreadsheet will just keep doing it cumulatively, and you end up showing progress because you've been able to go from where they finish up, as it were. Let me go back 2 slides. From where they started to where they finish, you can show the progress that they've made over that amount of time. And so that's what we think is quite useful to be able to do.
And that's all very well, but basically that's only then supported by having music to go alongside it. Otherwise, there really is no difference with just having a set of numbers in a spreadsheet. Well, they could stay in a spreadsheet. You don't need to necessarily make these to go alongside, but actually it's the music itself which you are trying to kind of encapsulate. I want to pick up as we come towards the end on a comment from Mary, which is very pertinent to both of our day jobs as well. It says, as trainee teachers, do you have any advice on how we would go about giving a fully rounded assessment without levels when we have very little experience? Something that we both do is the same job as Mary, I think. Training teachers in their training year through the university and school partnerships. And I mean, there's lots of different strategies, and sometimes it's about having an idea in mind, and in a lesson, having 4 or 5 children in a different ones each time in your mind, and getting to the end of the lesson and thinking, from everything I've seen today and the conversations I've had with them, where are they? What did they get out of my lesson in relation to what I wanted them to get out of my lesson, and how do I know? So having a kind of dedicated focus on just 5 or 6 pupils, and I think that's pretty good practice in whether or not you're talking about assessment, but it also links inherently to assessment.
And it relates to the things that we're talking about here, because we've shown these, they're called radar charts, being filled in. It's possible, and we are entirely happy, in fact we suggest that people think about what are these main axes that they're talking about. Choose your own axes, fill in the numbers accordingly. We've given you some suggestions there to begin with, but please use others. For student teachers, maybe they would want to cooperate and find out what they are working on. But this is a way to do it, and this is a start. One music teacher said to me that they really liked this idea because their deputy head had said to him, it's great, it's in a spreadsheet, it's therefore worthwhile. And so if that's the answer, that as long as it figures in a spreadsheet, the deputy head thinks it's worthwhile, I think that's probably moving towards job done.
I think the word radar comes up over again as well, because I also explain to my trainee teachers that they need a teacher radar on their head, 360 degrees all the time, spinning around, looking at how children are communicating in and through music when they're creating, making, exploring, notating what they're talking about, what the kinds of things that they're asking. So yes, the word radar very much links back to the middle spreadsheet. Spreadsheet. Alan, really? Must be nearly 5 o'clock, Martin.
I think it's nearly 5 o'clock, and at this point, I think we're going to have to wend our way off into the great big Ethernet yonder.
David's asked a question about, can we be sent a spreadsheet template? I think there's some stuff on your website, Martin.
Yes, there isn't a template because it very much depends on the software that you're using, but it is a built-in function of the software that we use to do this. I don't really want to turn it into a sort of techie session where we discuss how you do it, but it is straightforward. And yes, and please do look on my blog and it will talk about this, but I can't give detailed answers apart from the ones that I've done. So, but I'm sure that if you're a teacher in a school, the average friendly maths teacher would be more than happy to be brought to beer and explaining to you. At which point we're going to say that the stuff that we've been talking about is available here on the website, which appears on your screens now. And at that point, I think it's thank you very much.
It always seems like a short amount of time, an hour.
It does.
When we finally actually get around to it, we have so much to say.
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Carry on. We'll see you down the virtual pub.